Hello, and welcome to Language and Logic Part 1. This is the second chapter of Mr. Hurley's text as we're reading through it for Philosophy 8, Deductive Logic. And for the readings, concentrate on section 2.1 and 2.2. This will be the same for this and the following lecture. And once again, they're the same pages in the custom edition as the full 12th edition. Part 1 on language, we will consider language is one of the characteristics unique to human nature that defines us as a species. Aristotle put his finger on this. Then philosophy dropped the ball for nearly 2,000 years. In the 20th century, social science, anthropology, ethology, linguistics picked this up. Language use is rooted in our evolutionary biology. In the 20th century, philosophy too picked it up, but in a constricted way. Logical positivism. And we'll see that both of these developments have relevance for our consideration of the role of language in logic. There's a paradox here. On the one hand, language is so basically fundamental to what makes us human, and Aristotle got this, but then philosophy ignored it for many, many centuries. For philosophy to have come back at last, the language is a good thing. As Bertie Russell said, it's a disgrace to the human race that it has chosen to employ the same word is for these two entirely different ideas, the is of identity and the is of predication, a disgrace which symbolic logical language, of course, remedied. And that was the response that philosophy had in the 20th century. It was at least an incorporation of language into considerations of logic, and those we'll see it did have some downsides. What is often called modern logic, or sometimes classical logic, sets itself against ordinary language by way of coping with the problem of ambiguity. Ambiguity, as we shall see, is indeed a problem, but there may be another solution to it, one owing to some more old-fashioned approaches like those of Aristotle and Kant, and some new ones from cognitive psychology and the like. Increased interest in language among philosophers has not been entirely unclouded or non-controversial. At one point, Popper was so frustrated with the narrowness of 20th century language philosophy, he said this: words don't matter. It's Karl Popper. Words don't matter. What does this mean? Is language just unimportant? Well, it's one thing to say that endless navel-gazing at words and their meanings is pointless. It would be another to say quite broadly that language does not matter. Popper doesn't say this. On the contrary, here's what he says: I am bored by discussions about the meanings of words, but if you suggest that I do not regard language as important, well, then that is quite incorrect. I think there is nothing as important as language. I have a theory according to which it is language which makes us human, and that human consciousness, the consciousness of self, is a result of language. Thus, about language, Popper seems to be saying no less than Aristotle before him. Popper also says it's impossible to speak in a way that you cannot be misunderstood. That is, there are limits on trying to eliminate the ambiguity in language and speech. But Popper is one of those who, unlike Russell, perhaps Ayer, think that clarifying ambiguity has its limits. Now, every logic textbook has a chapter 2, a chapter on language, and ours is no exception. Why do we worry about it? Well, again, recall our basic definitions of logic and argument. Logic is the study of argument. What's argument? It's a group of statements. Again, that's a linguistic definition rather than a psychological or sociological, anthropological definition. And an argument is a group of statements, in that group, one or more of which supports one of the others. In other words, our basic definition of argument, and therefore also of logic, is linguistic. The psychology of anger doesn't enter into it. The anthropology of interaction, likewise, not. Now, as Popper indicated, language use also defines us as a species, Homo sapiens, or Homo sapiens sapiens, like the flatter ourselves. And Aristotle hit on this fact millennia ago when he said, man is two things: zoon politikon kai logon echon. Man is the political animal and the speaking animal. That's Aristotle's famous man. Zoon is the animal, politikon is the political, and logon is having words. Now, most of what Aristotle said, though these 2,500 years ago, has not stood the test of time. But the notion of language use and also of politics as definitive of our species, well, this one remains insightful. But strangely, between Aristotle's time and our own, philosophers have had little to say about language. The 20th century, however, has seen the heyday of language philosophy. The 20th century became the epoch both of language philosophy and of linguistics. In the 20th century, not only was language revived within philosophy, linguistics itself became an important area of study. And if Aristotle kicked it off for philosophy, Noam Chomsky is the name to conjure with for linguistics in the 20th century, probably the single most important linguist of the modern period. Let's look at a bit from BBC 4 here.
Language sets us apart. Other animals communicate, but they don't have anything approaching the sophisticated grammar of human languages. How is it that we learn to speak and think in language so easily? Young children become adept in a new language very quickly. Since the dawn of philosophy, thinkers have argued about whether or not we have innate ideas, whether we are born knowing things as Plato believed, or rather as John Locke and other empiricists argued, the mind is a blank slate on which experience writes. An American linguist, Noam Chomsky, gave a twist to this debate in the 1960s by demonstrating that children learning to speak just don't have enough information to form the complex grammatical maneuvers that allow them to generate unlimited new and original sentences. Yet they do so with ease. There's a poverty of stimulus. Something else must be going on. Chomsky's hypothesis was that there are inborn structures in our brain, what he called a language acquisition device, or LAD, which gives us a natural propensity to organize the spoken language that we hear in various grammatical ways. Without that, we couldn't get started as language learners. If he's right, language structure is hardwired as a kind of universal grammar. Our slates have been written on before we emerged from the womb.
So Chomsky says, as Popper also does, language use defines what it means to be human. Other species may do things like using tools, they may communicate, they may even vocalize, but humans are the only species that uses language. Not, of course, the only species that communicates, nor the only one who vocalizes. Parrots vocalize too. My Senegal parrot Claudine was very fluent in cat, and she could mimic my wife and the microwave, and the door hinges opening and closing. But neither sheer communication nor sheer vocalization, parroting as it were, amounts to speech. Bees communicate by doing dances to tell hive mates where to find flowers for nectar. Ants communicate by laying down scent trails of pheromones. You want to get rid of ants, you wipe out their trail, and they'll get confused and they'll go somewhere else, perhaps. Other than your kitchen. Now, we used to fancy our kind as unique. We now understand that we're not necessarily unique, although we are still distinct. But it has a long history. What does the psalmist say? What is man that thou art mindful of him, and the son of man that thou visitest him? Thou hast made him a little lower than the angels, and hast crowned him with glory and honor. Thou madest him to have dominion over the works of thy hands. Thou hast put all things under his feet. Shakespeare chimes in. What a piece of work is man! How noble in reason, how infinite in faculties, in form and moving, how express and admirable in action, how like an angel in apprehension, how like a god. The beauty of all the world, the paragon of animals. So, a little lower than the angels, the paragon of animals. From being in the psalmist's day a little lower than the angels in the crown of creation to becoming in Shakespeare's day the paragon of animals, we now apprehend ourselves as one more animal on an evolutionary continuum located on the third rock circling an insignificant star among many, many others. We're the third rock from the sun, we are one among a number of species from to all of whom we are related, from some of whom we have descent. In other words, the Copernican and the Darwinian revolutions in between the Psalms and Shakespeare have made a considerable impact. We used to think of humanity as totally unique among species, but the more we learn, the more it's been whittled away from the catalog of distinctly human attributes. We humans like to think of ourselves as a unique species. However, little by little, all those traits that we've been relying on to ground this uniqueness have been falling as the science advances and reveals the staggering diversity and complexity of animal minds and behavior. Yes, indeed, and science has gone a long way. For example, we used to define humans as the tool-using species, but we now know fashion tools to catch termites. They're actually very adept to this. They pick a particular stick, certain kinds of sticks. They don't just grab any stick. They stick down and they'll pull out the termites and then eat them. Ravens and crows also fashion tools. Guys are really, really adept. Homo sapiens, that's us, shares a lot with our primate cousins. One of the things we have is opposable thumbs. Primates all do that. Our closest living relative is chimpanzee, from whom at the genetic level we differ really quite little. We share, depending on how one counts this, up to 94 to 99% of DNA. So that's quite a lot. But we have vastly different behaviors, though, and vastly different cognitive capacities. There do remain a few qualitative differences in our species, and Aristotle hit on two of them way, way, way back: politics and language. So on politikon kailogon echo. More than just social, more than just communicative, more than just vocal. A leading textbook in social psychology, here's the 12th edition now, but we used an earlier edition when I took social psych in sophomore year, calls man the social animal. Well, true, humans are social, but so are many other species. To be social is merely, as the sociologist Max Weber put it, to conduct ourselves in ways oriented toward others. Any creature which does that is social. Well, ants are social. Dogs are social. They have clear pecking orders. Bees are social insects. They live in hives and they work together. Bees are communicative. The waggle dance they do allows bees to scout flowers and to report back where to find the pollen and where to get stuff for the nectar. And bees are builders too. They build their hives and their honeycombs and so forth. But here's the difference, as Karl Marx pointed out some time ago. Spider conducts operations that resemble those of a weaver, and a bee puts to shame many an architect in the construction of her cells. But what distinguishes the worst of architects from the best of bees is this: that the architect raises his structure in imagination before he erects it in reality. That's the difference. Humans can use symbols to foresee outcomes. Bees don't do that. Bees merely enact stereotypes. No matter how good the bee architect is, the condo is always going to be a hexagon. Now, humans are capable of building more complex structures. These are not actual structures. These are hypothetical structures that might be built floating islands. This is pictured off the coast of Monaco. If you go to Monaco, you're not going to see these floating off the beach, but they are things that humans could construct, possible things for the future. Spiders are builders, but they're not architects. Likewise, bees and dogs are social, but they don't engage in politics. The dogs are not going to play cards and use strategy and try to get over on each other that way. Of all the animal species, only humans are the political animal. What makes humans architects, not just builders, political and not just social, is our ability to symbolize, that is, to use language. So there's communication, there's vocalization, there's language, there's speech. Not all species have all of these things. Communication can go beyond words. Ants can communicate with chemicals, pheromones. Bees can communicate with dance. Dogs can communicate with gestures. My dogs, when they want to go out, they stand by the door to the kitchen. That's a signal to me, open the door, let them out. They wait patiently. Dogs can ask, in other words. And my dogs will hesitate before they jump on my lap. They'll look at me and see if they have permission, and then they'll jump up. So yeah, dogs can communicate and even ask questions. A couple of parrots. Can we talk? Well, no, not really. Parrots can vocalize. Vocalization is not the same as language use. When we humans vocalize, we also use speech and language. This is unique among species. Language use is not just verbal behavior, not just mimicry, but instead it's something generated by the speaker. This is one of the big points that Noam Chomsky has driven home in the course of his research. Even a small child can form sentences he has never before heard. Parrots can vocalize by mimicking the parrot words, sometimes not so nice words. Dogs also vocalize. They do so without words. In fact, the vocalization of dogs is one of the reasons we've domesticated them. How did we do this? Well, all the various breeds of dogs, anything from the Great Dane to the Dachshund, anything in between, descend from wolves. Now, wolves were social animals, and are social animals, and cooperatively in packs. During the hunt, they vocalize to each other. That's what the barking and yipping is all about. It's, hey, come this way. Here's where the prey is. And so they are pre-wired to respond to vocal directions. There's also among wolves, and therefore among dogs also, a hierarchy in which alpha dog keeps his head higher than subordinate dog. So it's a very complex structure going on in wolf and therefore in dog behavior. By the way, the last thing is the reason why if you're training a puppy, you don't want to get down at the puppy's level. You know, sometimes people like to do that. They like to get down on all fours and tussle with the puppy. No. Because that confuses the puppy. Until the puppy gets to know you really well, till it grows a bit, you got to keep your head higher than his. And that tells them that you're the alpha dog. Your dog doesn't know that you're not another dog. Dog doesn't know you're a human. Dog knows that you're you're the other creature, and you keep the head above. So you're alpha. Parrots, by the way, are the same way. If you're training a parrot, keep the parrot down here at eye level. Don't put the parrot up above, because parrots, exactly. Humans were able to domesticate dogs because wolf behavior was already, as the biologists would say, exapted human society. Like wolves, we too vocalize because we're taller, our heads tend to be higher. So there was sort of a fit there. And there's my little dachshund, Hansel, who died this thing. So we talk to dogs, we use their names, and they listen to us, but they don't understand the language that we're using. So here's what we say to dogs. Okay, Ginger, I've had it. You stay out of the garbage. Understand, Ginger? Stay out of the garbage or else. And what Ginger hears is blah, 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 Ginger, blah, 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 Ginger. She thinks being praised. Okay, be careful. Your dog doesn't understand the words you say. With a dog, it's not what you say, it's how you say it. So if you want to impress your message on Ginger, you very, very loud and up in her face. Also, your dog doesn't know that you're not just another dog. Because your head is higher, you're simply alpha dog, leader of the pack, and try to keep it. Okay, so crows use tools, bees communicate, parrots and dogs vocalize, but humans are the only ones who talk. Now, there's something about our biology, our peculiar biology, that facilitates this. When our species is born, unlike any other species, our young are curiously unfinished at birth. We are not extensively hardwired with instincts. We have to pick up a lot. It's a learning process that goes on. And in fact, we'll talk about this down the road. Someone had suggested that basically, the first year or so of human development is an extruded womb. It's like the kind of development which would be intrauterine for most other species really takes place after birth for humans, and that makes a considerable difference in a number of ways. But although we don't have a lot of hardwiring in terms of instincts, the distinctive thing we have is we are hardwired for language use. That seems to be something that's deeply set in our neurology. So let's look at the biological grounds for this, for human culture, for language. Human nature is a standard topic in philosophy. And again, if you've taken the philosophy course before, or if you've looked at some of the lectures from that course that I have on YouTube, you will see some of this. The technical term for this is philosophical anthropology, and of course, it's humanities. The political and linguistic aspects which define human nature, however, have roots in our biology. So we need to stop a moment and consider these roots. Here's a famous picture. This is Konrad Lorenz. Konrad Lorenz was the founder of ethology, actually, the study of behavior. And here he is. He's an old Austrian guy, so he's wearing his Bunthos, Austria, and walking through a field with a bunch of, I can't tell, these are ducks or geese walking behind him. It's like he was mother goose or mother duck. And the reason for this is that waterfowl, like geese and ducks, have an imprinting instinct. And basically the way this works is when they hatch, come out of the egg, they pattern on the first moving object they see, they follow. Now, 99.9% of the time, that first moving object is mother duck or goose. But Lawrence hatched the eggs here, the fowl, and he was the first one they saw, so they followed him. And normally this works. They follow mother duck or mother goose down to the water. She gets in and swims. They get in and swim, eat certain things. They eat certain things, and they learn how to be ducks and geese. And after a while, the imprinting instinct fades, so they're ready to go off, on their own and fend for themselves. But Lawrence here, now birds don't really think of Lawrence as their mother, but they're following a hardwired instinct that says, pattern on this first moving object, keep following it, and that's what they're doing here. They followed him just like they would have followed mother. Lots of species have lots of these things. We tend to have very few. Anybody have a dog? You ever seen your dog turn around in circles before they bed down, maybe on your carpet or on your bed? What's the dog doing? Well, what the dog is doing is trampling down the grass. But you may say, I don't have grass growing on my carpet or on my bed. No, but dogs evolved in grasslands. In order to lie down, they trampled in the grass. And so they developed, it was selected for in evolution, a tropism for doing this, but hardwired into their nervous system so that even when it's no longer functional, it's not now that they live in our houses instead of in the grasslands, they do it anyway. Behaviors in their nervous system, hardwired into their gene code. In the case of the waterfowl, the imprinting instinct remains functional 99.99% of the time. That is, until that one time when this crazy Austrian guy decides to hatch your eggs. Mother do it. In the case of dogs, it's no longer functional. It's not harmful. It's just redundant unless it seems a little bit bizarre. So by and large, all of the species have a lot of this stuff. We have a little bit, but relatively little, relatively few instincts. Oh, do humans exhibit some bizarre, non-functional behaviors too? Yeah, don't just laugh at the dogs. We do. The fight or flight syndrome is an example of that. It seems to have served some survival value in earlier times when we faced a lot of predators. Now we generally don't face predators every day, and so the fight or flight, release of adrenaline and all the other things that happen, the tunneling of vision and hyperventilation, all that stuff, not necessarily functional, often gets in the way, but it's there in our neurology, given our evolutionary history. More commonly, though, bizarre non-functional behaviors among humans are learned rather than genetically hardwired. What Thurston Veblen and later Kenneth Burke called trained incapacity, learned helplessness. Think about that. How can you learn to be helpless? Helpless, it seems to be a lack of something, but learned helplessness to be a positive something. Likewise, the notion of goal displacement. I got a question for you. What do Michael Jackson and the Chicago Cubs have in common? Both have a glove on one hand for no apparent reason. That is to say, silly, functionless behavior. So that's one example among humans. Here's a more serious one. The story about holding the horses. Have to do a little background here. Taylorism. In the early 20th century, Charles Taylor, Frederick Winslow, Charles Taylor, someone else, developed a study, basically trying to observe steps in manufacturing processes, was to find out which ones were functionalist and then eliminate them, thus streamlining the process and presumably increasing profits. And so, one of the things they would do is they would take a series of photographs, for example, of people on an assembly line, and then lay the photographs out, look at them and say, okay, well, here's a stage we can eliminate, here's a stage we can eliminate. We started with 12 steps, and now we're down, say, 8 or 9. Good. Process is more streamlined, therefore more efficient. Early in World War II, because that was the background to the Shaggy Dog story. Early in World War II, the British Army applied this do artillery drill, hoping to make the artillery more faster and more efficient, just like an assembly line or seamstresses or what have you, more efficient. And the story is told in Melting Morrison. Basically, the tailor students, they took photos of the artillery crew firing a gun, and just before the gun was fired, everybody would come to attention, and one guy would do this, hold his hand like this, and then the gun would fire. They didn't know what this was all about, so they took the photos, they laid them on the table, they're questioning about them, and an artillery officer walks by and he says, "Can I help you?" And they said, "No, so here's, I probably don't understand. What's this guy doing?" "Oh, it's easy. He's holding the horses." Well, at this time in World War II, the British Army had done away with its horses. Now the Germans did not, by the way. The Americans and the British and the French too were more mechanized. The Germans still had a lot of horses. If you've seen the film Band of Brothers, HBO film, there's a scene toward the end of the war where the Americans are going in the Autobahn. Hitler so generously created the Autobahn so that troops could be moved, and so the Americans are taking advantage of this. They're going in on all four lanes, and the German prisoners are marching out in the median strip on the grass with all their horses. And there's a scene where the American soldier says, and I think it actually happened based on an actual event. Some Americans just, "What were you people thinking? You've got horses." And he points to the truck he's riding. He says, "General fucking Motors." The Germans got caught behind them. Everybody else had pretty much gotten rid of their horses in the 30s. But in World War I, of course, as late as World War I, they were still using horses. And the artillery manual was written early when there were still horses. So yes, in the artillery manual, there was a step in the firing process whereby everybody came to attention, and one guy held the horses so they didn't get spooked and run away. Okay. In the context of having artillery that no longer needed horses, it seemed kind of silly and functionless. Goal displacement. Often terminal patients, is very common, are offered morphine to relieve their pain. They've got a couple days to live, they're in serious pain, and they refuse. Why? Because they don't want to get hooked on drugs. Okay, well, if you have years and years and years of life to live, you don't want to become a heroin addict. Yes, understandable, but there's a goal there in not taking heroin or not taking morphine. But if you got days to live and it's your only source of relief, that seems point. But many people do this. They're so hooked on the war against drugs. I'm not going to do drugs under any circumstances that they cause themselves stress. There's one example of goal displacement. Here's another. In various places in cold weather, people will do things like build ice hotels. And in Sweden, they do this. Here's a hotel built entirely of ice, including the bed. The bed's ice, so they put animal skins on it. It's a kind of a vanity tourist destination. But for 2013, Swedish officials demanded that they install fire alarms because the law said, all hotels must have fire alarms. Well, when's a fire going to break out in a building made of ice? It's just, but, they're not thinking about it. They're just, following the goal, even though the goal is sort of out of sight. As a general rule, humans have relatively few hardwired behavioral tropisms because fewer instincts are inflicted on us by nature. Those strange, silly behaviors like this we have are things that we inflict on ourselves rather than nature, biology doing it to us. But there is a profound biological reason for this general rule, and that reason is this. Humans are delayed. Humans are delayed, as in developmentally delayed. We used to call retarded, instinctually underdeveloped, developmentally delayed. We don't have nearly the instincts that other species have, so therefore we have to compensate for them. Humans have language for the general reason we have any culture of any sort at all, because we need it in compensation for certain defects in our biology. When we're born, we have not yet finished our fetal development, whereas other species typically have. So we need a certain amount of scaffolding, and this is what we call culture and society. So we finish our development, and we finish it in different ways. A dog is a dog is a dog is a dog, no matter whether he grows up in Canada or Nigeria. But human makes a difference, whether you're in Canada or Nigeria or any other particular society. Peter Berger and Thomas Luckmann, in their book on this subject, The Social Construction of Reality, say this: man occupies a peculiar position in the animal kingdom. Like the other higher mammals, he has no species-specific environment, no environment firmly structured by his own instinctual organization. There is no man world in the sense that one may speak of a dog world or a horse world. We'll see an example of an elephant world in just a minute, or a goose world. By contrast, they continue, man's relationship to his environment is characterized by world openness. Man's instinctual organization may be described as underdeveloped compared with that of other higher mammals. Indeed, one looks at the matter in terms of organismic development, it's possible to say that the fetal period in the human being extends to the first year after birth. This is that extruded womb idea. Our fetuses are still developing after they're born. Society and culture constitute this extruded womb. Development, which in other species would culminate in utero, must for humans continue after expulsion. Uterus is dead. Important organismic developments within the animal are completed in the mother's body take place in the human infant after its separation from the womb. At this time, however, the human infant is not only in the outside world, but interrelating with it in a number of complex ways. Thus, the human organism is still developing biologically while already standing in relationship to its environment. So this is something that's very, very different about us, very distinctive. They summarize it by saying this: man is curiously unfinished at birth. Curiously unfinished at birth. Thus, a key reason for some of our distinct cognitive features as humans lies precisely in the evolutionary biology of our world openness. This, I think, is an interesting point, because when social scientists study culture and society, they draw a contrast between that and biology, between society and nature. And what Berger and Luckmann are saying is there is a natural grounding for this differentiation in itself is a biological fact. Consider pregnancy. Okay, human pregnancy, 9 months. How long are elephants pregnant? Oh, 22 months. Think about that. Women in particular. Imagine being pregnant for 22 months. And then you give birth to an elephant-sized baby. Here's an elephant mother giving birth. Now, that elephant, though, is going to be much more adept, and it's going to be up on its feet within a matter of hours, and it's going to be doing, starting to learn adult elephant things right from the beginning. Let's watch this video. It's really instructing. Here's a newborn elephant.
She gave birth very, very quickly. One of the quickest births I've seen again. It's a female calf. We've been very lucky. This is our third female calf out of 4 births that we've had here at Paradisa. She's a very experienced mum, Farina. She's a fantastic mum. She's done very well. As you can see, the herd have been all together. As you see, the birth is all together as a family as it should be. So all the younger elephants and all the way up to Grandma was involved, including our oldest elephant, Mala.
This calf is about to walk, and it takes humans 12 months to do this. This is minutes after its birth.
She's very, very strong. She was up on her feet extremely quickly, and she's already starting to suckle. So she's very quickly trying to find her way in the world.
Here she is.
This is another step forward in protecting an endangered species. There's only 38,000 of these fantastic animals left in the wild today. So every one that we breed, especially females, are critically important.
That's stunning. Okay, so why do elephants develop in utero 22 months. I mean, human infants only get 9 months. Birthing bones. An elephant walks on all fours. She's a quadruped. She has wide birthing bones. Humans have narrow birthing bones because we walk upright. And any conceptus that would develop beyond about 9 months in the uterus would not be able to be expelled, and so not pass on its genes, and the mother would not pass on her genes if that was the birthing process for her. So, this would be selected against. With bipedalism, with walking on 2 rather than 4 limbs, we have contracted the amount of time that our young can spend in the uterus, and therefore we have to do a lot more work once they're outside. So, other species tend to be finished at birth, tend to be guided by instinct, hardwired into their neurology. Our species tends to be unfinished at birth and instinctually underdeveloped. Think about rabbits. Domestic rabbits can be weaned at 4 weeks, wild rabbits at 2 weeks. Domestic rabbits live a little bit longer, 10 plus years, wild rabbits about 3 years. They have more predators and so forth. So nurture is respectively 0.8 and 1.4% of the lifetime. That is a relatively very small amount. Imagine what would happen if we turned our infants loose after even 4 weeks. They wouldn't survive. They need a lot longer time to develop before they're ready to go off on their own. How long? Well, let's see. Bar mitzvah, which is a pre-industrial survival. It's a Judaism practices this ceremony, and bat mitzvah for the girls, bar mitzvah for the boys, where they become an adult. At a bar mitzvah ceremony, the boy says, at age 13, today I have become a man. And indeed, in the pre-industrial society, when you get to be a teenager, when you're sexually mature, you're also socially mature. Now, this carries over from that kind of society into our own, in which that's not strictly the case. But basically, if you became a man, at 13 and your lifespan was as modern lifespans are, it's about 19%, close to 0.8 or 1.4, remember the rabbits. Quinceañera is a similar pre-industrial sort of survival among Hispanic cultures. Girl becomes a woman at age 15, it's 21%. More realistic for our society is high school graduation at 18. That's 26%, a little more than a quarter. College graduation at 22, 31%. And then they move back home when they're 30, almost half. So pre-industrial lifespan of 30 to be adult is to be sexually mature. Today I become a man at 13, a woman becomes a woman at 15. In industrial society, we have a lifespan of more like 70. So to become an adult is to become educated, ready to join the workforce. In France, to become an adult is to be a parent. Much more so than in many other countries. Even in this country, you're not, if you're a single adult, you're not really considered adult until you get married and start a family of your own. But it varies from place to place. So today I became a man, says the little boy at his bar mitzvah. Tomorrow I need to do my homework. We graph this on a chart. This is what we get. Our species spends a relatively greater proportion, much greater proportion of its time getting ready for adult life than, let's say, rabbits, as this bar graph illustrates. This may be instinctual underdevelopment, may be the biological underpinning for what Jean-Paul Sartre claimed about human nature. We are condemned to freedom. It's the peculiar thing about humans. We're free to do absolutely everything we can imagine, except not to be free. We all want. Anyway. So in a curious way, from a philosopher's point of view, freedom may result from determinism. Point about the biological underpinning seems to say part of this determinism is biological. Freedom, yes, but it also requires artificial support, scaffolding, a life world. We call this compensatory scaffolding culture. Where nature runs out, humans scaffold. Culture is compensatory. We develop culture, including language, because we lack something that other species have. Culture compensates for instinctual deprivation. Again, Berger Lichtmann said, there's no man world in the sense that one may speak of a dog world or a horse world, or, as we've seen, an elephant world, or a goose world. Our biology thus constrains our species specifically to construct a life world, or rather life worlds, plural, because we're free to concoct any number of customs and cultures. So we look at human practices around the world. religious, sexual, kinship, political, and other institutional arrangements, very, very diverse. If you're born in Nigeria or Canada, it makes a difference for all these things. If you're born a dog, whether you're in Nigeria or Canada, doesn't matter. They're ready to go anyway. Duality is like this. Rabbits have the rabbit habit. Indeed, all of their species know how to mate by instinct. Humans are the only ones that need to be taught to mate. And if they don't learn the appropriate things, and of course it's not, it's just back alley chatter among children, but then they don't, they miss a critical period. We say it's doing what comes naturally. Actually, it doesn't come naturally, not for us. We don't have the rabbit habit. But sexuality has to be learned because it's not a given life world. Human sexual practices are so diverse, culture to culture. We talk about the missionary position for sex. Well, it had to be introduced by the European missionaries because apparently the objects of their missionary zeal did things differently. And humans have an extraordinary variety of sexual positions. Dogs, they just have one. Instinct can be so boring. Dogs are going to trample down grass. Geese are going to imprint. Bees are going to build hexagons. China or Canada makes no difference. For bees, the condo is always going to be just a hexagon. That's boring. The life worlds of humans, on the other hand, the languages, to politics, to religion, or the lack of religion, China or Canada does make a difference. Languages like this too. We have the constraint of biological underpinning at the same time the latitude to improvise. Neurologically, we're hardwired not to have a fixed instinctual man world, so we have the option of devising various political orders. We also seem hardwired with this Chomskyan language acquisition device that Gillian Anderson mentioned in the BBC video. Will not be born knowing the content of any particular language. So if you speak English, it's not because you were born knowing how to speak English, or Spanish or Tagalog or whatever language you do speak as a first language, but we have the world openness to acquire any particular language. This child is not hardwired to learn her mother's language as her first language, but she is hardwired to learn any one or more of the languages in the background in a way that no other species is. All normal humans and only humans have the capacity to generate languages. Chomsky's big, even though the kid from the family, what is it? I can't think of the show. Reading. Furthermore, as Chomsky noticed very early on, this happens rapidly with every first language. Now, it couldn't happen if it were true, B.F. Skinner says, that verbal behavior is learned by mimicry, nor could it happen if, as John Locke said, the mind is entirely a blank slate. Remember, Gillian Anderson pointed out the nature-nurture controversy behind all of this. Okay, what about chimpanzees? Aren't they our closest relatives? They are. If we can speak, can't chimpanzees also speak, or at least use language? Well, they don't. Attempts to teach them to speak fail because they don't have the appropriate vocal structure to do oral language like we do. So researchers turned instead to American Sign Language. They could use their hands, presumably. And here we have two famous chimpanzees, Washoe and Nim Chimpsky, who he was named after. Washoe learned about 350 ASL signs. Nim Chimpsky, they both died fairly early on, made it 275 characters. But that's not a lot. The average human child is well on track by the age of 2 or so to outstrip mature chimpanzee vocabulary. So there's no real comparison there. And furthermore, the child is going to generate sentences, saying things they've not heard before, and not just mimicking. Humans, but only humans, but universally across the human species, have the capacity to generate language. Chomsky's insight into this fact is sometimes called Cartesian linguistics. He gives it this name in a teasing way. It's a backhanded tribute to René Descartes, who argued that ideas are innate, and slapped down to John Locke, who said that our minds are a blank slate. They're not entirely blank. They're blank of content, yes, but they're not entirely blank. There is some capacity there, neurological hardwiring. Again, neither Chomsky nor anyone else today supposes that we're born knowing the content of English or Spanish or Tagalog or any other specific language either, for that matter. But the open-ended capacity to acquire, and most importantly then to generate any specific language, that's what seems to be innate to humans. It is species specific. Now, Chomsky put this thesis forward in the 1950s. And remember, the structure of DNA was only elucidated basically in 1953. And it took maybe 15, 20 years until people began to work out some practical implications of that. And then the Human Genome Project, for example, going in the 1990s, it was kind of cutting edge stuff. As that's gone on, we've been pinning down more and more markers in the genetic code for this and that human trait. There's some debate over whether there could even be some specific language gene, and there probably won't be. I think it's the consensus now, but there seem to be a definite genetic basis for language use. If Chomsky's right, there has to be however we end up characterizing it. And again, this is still ongoing. So, to sum up, the compensations of culture include, first of all, a distinctly human sexuality, which is subject to immense variety, voluntary rather than seasonal, and learned rather than innate. Also, politics, one's ability to raise some structure and imagination before he erects it in reality, as Marx put it, to choose different kinds of life worlds, since we lack much of the life world already ordered by instinct. And thirdly, language. Modes of communication, again, in a variety, using vocalization and generated by some distinctive features of the human nervous system. Now, Aristotle was pre-Freud, so he said a little about the sexual bit, but he was far-sighted in that he did pinpoint the last two again. That is the political animal and the speaking animal. That was distinctive, it still is. However, having hit on that really early on, real big achievement for Aristotle, for more than 2,000 years thereafter, philosophers had remarkably little more to say on the topic of language. In fact, Aristotle wasn't the first philosopher to think about language, as Bertie Russell points out. Parmenides was the first one to do that. Throughout the course of history, St. Anselm, for example, with his famous argument for the existence of God, started out with language, started with a definition of God, and then tried to derive an existence claim. So that's an attempt to use language. Kant shows that the predicate is the subject of a sentence, so he introduced that kind of analysis. And Feuerbach, following Kant, went on to develop an interesting argument about God, the nature of God. The predicates of God tend to be human attributes, and therefore God is really man in disguise. Parmenides and St. Anselm and Kant and Feuerbach are the exceptions, notable ones, but the general rule is otherwise. Between Aristotle and the 20th century, philosophy was silent on language mostly, with those few exceptions. Now, such silence as there was had to do with the fact that philosophers, and so from Plato onwards at least, regarded language as simply a transparent means, something to be pierced and peered beyond some underlying non-linguistic reality to truth, beauty, justice, and so forth. Philosophers in particular were not self-conscious about language itself. Only from the 20th century did they become so. Well, language is sort of like the water that the fish swims in. Does the fish know about water? Is the fish the last being to discover water? Language was simply the water in which the philosophers swam. They didn't notice it. This all changed. This changed all philosophy when they did discover this. Philosophy tended to become talk about talk, as people say, and this in turn fundamentally altered our view of some of the classical problems in philosophy. Language went from being beneath notice to becoming quite central to our attention in the 20th century. So philosophy drops the language ball and philosophy recovers, but this is pretty late in the game. As over the course of the many centuries we had philosophy, only within the last century or so, century and a half, we hear a lot of sustained, we see a lot of sustained attention to language. Okay. So language is central to what it means to be human. Aristotle grasped this fact. Subsequent philosophy ignored this fact. One philosophy came back in the 20th century for language. He did so in some very narrow ways, including in logic. Therefore, I think it is important for us to take a broader view. So let's back up a little bit. We looked at the history of ideas, the Whiggish history that I gave you in an earlier lecture. Let's come back to some of those topics. Look at logic specifically as it has developed in the history of ideas. Graham Priest, his very short introduction to logic is a good one. He says this on the subject. Logic is one of the most ancient intellectual disciplines and one of the most modern. Its beginnings go back to the 4th century BC, Parmenides, as I mentioned before. The only older disciplines are philosophy and mathematics, with both of which it has been intimately connected from the 19th to the 20th centuries. Mathematical techniques were applied to logic, causing a major revolution in its development. More recently, it has been important for the fields of computation and information processing, so from the very, very old to the very, very recent. Imagine Aristotle and Plato at their computer terminal. Okay, between Aristotle on the one hand and the 20th century folks we mentioned in the preceding Whiggish history, Frege, Russell, Wittgenstein, who developed symbolic logic in particular, what happened? Well, Kant said, and Kant, of course, major Enlightenment philosopher by the end of the 18th century, that logic has advanced in this short course, even from the earliest times, is apparent from the fact that since Aristotle, it has been unable to advance a step, and thus, to all appearance, has reached completion. Kant did not see the 20th century coming. He thought, Aristotle pretty much said it all. Well, no, he was wrong there. In fact, a great deal has taken place in logic since Kant. And of course, a great deal happened before. Again, Graham Priest, good summary statements. 3 great periods of development in logic. The first great period, ancient Greece, 400 BC to 200 BCE. Most influential figure here being Aristotle. The second growth period, again, we talked about this a bit in the Whiggish section. The early Middle Ages with Arabic philosophers, Ibn Rushd, Averroes, as they called him in Latin. Blossoms in the medieval European universities, Paris and Oxford from the 12th to 15th centuries. Duns Scotus, William of Ockham, Ed Abelard in there, systematized and developed the logic they inherited from ancient Greece. After that, stagnated until the 19th century, the only bright spot being Leibniz. And then thirdly, the development of abstract algebra in the 19th century provided just what was required and triggered the start of the third and possibly the greatest of the 3 periods. Radically new logical ideas were developed by thinkers such as Frege and Russell. The logical theories developing from this work are normally referred to as modern logic, as opposed to the traditional logic preceded it. Yes, and that's a fair statement. And of course, we are, parenthetically put here, we are doing a lot of traditional logic here, as well as commenting on modern logic. But the syllogisms and the Venn diagrams and that kind of stuff, that's all really more, that's some of the older stuff. We're not focusing on the symbolic logic, which is really 20th century stuff. There's a whole long history of logic, running from Socrates' student Euclid of Megara through Aristotle and Chrysippus, as we've seen, including the popularity of Aristotle's syllogistic logic during the Middle Ages, for which the period has become both famous and infamous. Angels dancing on the skin and all that. During the 19th century in Britain, figures like Lewis Carroll and George Boole began to develop logic in the direction which became central to British empiricism during the first half of the 20th century. Language and logic became a major theme in British philosophy, and American philosophy tends to follow what happens in Britain, at least it did during this era, during the first half of the 20th century. Ultimately, this is why all colleges have basic courses in logic like the one we're doing right now. That's the background. Symbolic logic develops in the 20th century. It's formulated to combat the ambiguities of natural languages. Carried over into the program of logical positivism, this became quite narrow. It started in mathematics, which Boole redefined as the study not of magnitude or number, but this is an interesting definition. Mathematics is the employment of symbols whose laws of combination are known and general and whose results admit of a constant interpretation. This work, the mathematical analysis of logic. Boole's algebra was supposed to be also a calculus logic, as it was called. Its form became more important than its content. From this, Russell would reduce math to logic and seek to symbolize logic also. During the early 20th century, Alfred North Whitehead, Bertie Russell, young Ludwig Wittgenstein continued a movement purify symbolic notation for logic that could express the content of propositions without the ambiguities inherent in ordinary language. The actual attempt to purify a symbolic notation might have had to wait on the development of algebra in the 19th century, but the ambition was a bit older. And Graham Priest just mentioned Leibniz. Leibniz wanted what he called a characteristica universalis, an algebra of concepts that would render all human communication clear. That is, the notion was if we could just speak clearly, if we could just iron out all the ambiguities and quirks in ordinary language, then we would communicate clearly, and we would also eliminate the need to quarrel about basic decisions. Here's how Leibniz put it: the only way to rectify our reasonings is to make them as tangible as those of mathematicians, so that we can find our error at a glance, and when there are disputes among persons, we can simply say, let us calculate, without further ado, to see who is right. Imagine that, eliminate all political wrangling, eliminate all ethical controversies, just get things straight, calculate, and figure out what to do. Well, now, clarity is important in many areas. Law, for instance. When you go before a court, if you argue a case, say, before the Supreme Court, you want to follow René Descartes and have clear and distinct ideas. Here's an example. This is a legal decision. I talked about this in other contexts. This is the majority opinion written by Harry Blackman in the Roe v. Wade case in 1973. Mortality rates for women undergoing early abortions where the procedure is legal appeared to be as low or lower than the rates for normal childbirth. Consequently, any interest in the state in protecting the woman from an inherently hazardous procedure, except when it would be equally dangerous for the poet, has largely disappeared in previous lecture. Now, you might see this is pretty clear. That Justice Blackmun wrote, something easily understood, well-reasoned, and so on and so forth. Not everyone agrees. Symbolic logic says no. It can be and need be stated more clearly. Here's an attempt to state the content. Of course, since we're not studying symbolic logic, this is not going to be transparent. But this is what some people say you really need. The step you need to take beyond that kind of verbiage, because it's still very fuzzy. And only when you reduce things to symbolism can you get real clarity. You get real clarity by eliminating all ambiguity. Even the clearest prose in ordinary natural language still needs translation into other symbols, into better symbols. This is the kind of stuff that Russell and Wittgenstein were going for. Purified logical notation only seems to say what natural language does. For example, the material conditional doesn't translate ordinary if P then Q exactly. The disjunction P or Q defaults to inclusive rather than exclusive disjunctions earlier. In other words, symbolic notation claims to be better than ordinary language because it first claims to be quite different from ordinary language. It's out to correct ordinary language because ordinary language can only go so far, can't really correct itself. One result of this is that today, if you have a developed philosophy program, now in my college we're very small, we have just 2 groups. But if you go to upper division philosophy university, you'll typically find a whole variety, including a variety of logic courses. And there are whole courses devoted to symbolic logic. The enterprise can be quite elaborate. Here's Kurt Gödel's proof of God. He claims he can prove the existence of God, not in any of the traditional verbal ways, but in this symbolic way. But of course, it's evident, that's not transparent to the average person. One has to first master a whole symbolic language in order to even to study that kind of argumentation. Now, in this introductory course, spoiler alert, I think I've said it before, we're not going to dwell on symbolism. One simply needs to be aware of its major point, namely, that what one can say in natural languages, things like English or German, isn't always completely identical to how one can assert basically the same thing, logical purity. I guess fair enough way to put it. Differences between a statement in ordinary language and one symbolized, for example, in truth functions, tend to be construed to the detriment of ordinary language, where maybe not necessarily. Symbolic purity can also lose some of the nuances of ordinary language. Suppose I say, she got married and had a baby. And then I say she had a baby and got married. Well, these two things are logically equivalent, but they don't really say the same thing. They don't convey exactly the same idea. They didn't back in the days when marriage was thought to be pre. There was a debate on this matter in which, in the mid 20th century, Peter Strawson criticized Bertie Russell for thinking that a logically purified language must reveal the structure of reality. Russell's response was that philosophy was mistaken in thinking it ought to analyze ordinary language rather than correct it. Ordinary language is irredeemable unless we can find some way to symbolically correct it. That was, and it's this point of Russell's from which logical positivism took off earlier. The ambition here was quite breathtaking. Stephen Toulmin, who was a dissenter from the Russell and positivism sort of view, said the ambition was like this: where Euclid was, there Russell shall be; where it was, their egos shall be. That is to say, the logical purification of language would set all science on as firm a foundation as Euclidean geometry was once done. Okay, we mentioned logical positivism. It's a movement that had its heydays from the 1930s to, well, charitably to the 1960s. Let's have a look at it, and not only for its own sake, because it is interesting for its own sake. It was an important movement in philosophy, but also for the fact that even though it's defunct now as a movement, it has an enduring residue. It echoes through the teaching of logic very often. We need to pay attention to that. Okay. Symbolic logic implied that a key task of philosophy was to trim and purify language. In different ways, the agenda of British empiricism and therefore of American analytic philosophy became language philosophy. The task of philosophy was second order. It was talk about talk, thinking about thinking, if you will. One of the landmarks in this whole debate was a book called Language, Truth, and Logic by Alfred Jules Ayer, Freddie Ayer, as he is known. He published it in 1936. It solidified a movement, solidified in Britain, a movement which had begun in Vienna, known as logical positivism. It was long influential. It echoes even today. Robin Fox said it was the book every young man wanted to write. Yes, it was. Very popular in its day. And by the way, still worth reading. A model of clarity and of clear prose. You know, you can hardly best that. Whether or not the ideas still work doesn't matter, but still an admirable work, and all philosophy students really at some point this work. Logical positivism would not come to a particularly good end, spoiler alert, but it was sweeping and it was radical. Ayer was a young Turk. He was only 21 when he started the book. His advisor said, "Oh, why don't you go over to Vienna and see what they're doing over there?" And his German wasn't very good, but he improved a little bit. And then he came back, and he took about 4 years to put the book out. But when it appeared, it shook up the English-speaking world of philosophy completely. Now, its effect was somewhat delayed by the onset of World War II, and Ayer, like many other people, left university and went into the army. But when he came back in the 50s, it really came into its own. And this is kind of an odd comparison, but Ayer was as influential in English philosophy in his day as Jean-Paul Sartre would be in his same era in French philosophy. They were both young Turks. They shook up their respective philosophical establishments. Ayer's book was Language, Truth, and Logic. Sartre's was Being and Nothingness, which appeared right at the end of World War II. Again, the effect of the war on the development of ideas and philosophy in particular. Ayer, of course, had nothing but contempt for Jean-Paul Sartre. This is a typical English attitude. He dismissed Ayer, the language philosopher, dismissed Sartre's kind of Being and Nothingness as he puts it, an egregious use of the verb to be. Doesn't even know what is, in other words. Ayer's dismissal of Sartre may be clever, but it may also amount to merely what Freud called the narcissism of minor differences. Both were young rebels against the stodgy philosophical establishments in their respective nations. Both had a comparably shaking up effect on their readers. Épater les bourgeois in Sartre's language. And dismiss is the key word in appreciating logical positivism. It was a bold statement of what philosophy could do, but also what it could not. It amounted also to perhaps the strongest statement imaginable of a strict empiricism. What goes back to Hume and its distinction between relations of ideas and matters of fact. What goes back to Locke, nothing in the intellect which is not first in the senses. Freddie Ayer was up to that kind of thing. As philosophers go, he was a big game hunter. He argued that two of the three traditional branches of philosophy were impossible and ought to be dismissed forthwith. That is, metaphysics, ethics, and epistemology. Of those three, metaphysics and ethics could go easily, leaving only epistemology. That's all we need. And epistemology, including science considered as a version of common sense. And we'll elaborate on this just momentarily. Thus, right off the bat, logical positivism greatly changed by greatly reducing the scope of traditional philosophy. One way to put this, logical positivism ruled out why questions in favor of how questions. Furthermore, epistemology became mainly a matter of figuring out appropriate and inappropriate use of language. Positivism put forward the verifiability principle of meaning, which held that a linguistic utterance is meaningful if and only if there could be some observation which verifies the truth of what the utterance asserts. Conversely, if language, that bit which is not just analytic, fails to rest on verifiable observation, then whatever is uttered merely appears to be a statement or assertion at all. In fact, it amounts rather to only a meaningless pseudo-assertion. So here's a summary statement of the verifiability theory of meaning. Every claim, every declarative sentence falls into one of three categories. Either it is true or false by logic or definition alone, that's Hume's ideas, or two, it is an empirical claim that is in principle verifiable or falsifiable via empirical observation. There's interpretation of Hume's matters of fact. Or third possibility, it's meaningless, or it could be reducible, one of these or a combination of them. But those are the three possibilities. Spoiler alert, this is not going to end well. Positivism is going to crash and burn. But it's, in light of what happened to it, it's both important and appropriate to pay it some tribute. Logical positivism stood for clarity against woolliness and humbug. It was a 20th century modernist reproof of the 19th century Victorian legacy of hypocrisy and religious moralism, which had long colored philosophy at great British universities. There's a point to be made here about the lasting influence of positivism. Whether its ambitious program failed or succeeded, not the only point. Positivism did set a tone for doing philosophy, which persists to this day in Britain and America, that philosophy needs to be tough-minded and hard-headed. Stuart Hampshire, in an interview with Brian McGee, makes this point, I think, very, very strongly. It's worth having a look at that, the reference at the bottom. Regarding logical positivism, one might well observe that it embodies simultaneously both the worst and the best aspect of the entire British empiricist tradition in philosophy, the worst being an incomplete epistemology, the best being its tough-mindedness. Logical positivism was iconoclastic, declaring that the old emperor had no clothes. And it was very sweeping. Logical positivism promised to make a clean break not only in academic philosophy, but in intellectual life generally. Fuzziness, wool. This is one metaphor to capture what positivism opposed. Shearing the sheep, sweeping the wool, that's what's needed. Or to use another metaphor, clear cutting of deadwood, clear cutting of underbrush, another metaphor often used to describe the project. But good question. Was any new thing built into the clearing? And Brian McGee is going to interview Ayer. This is really an interesting series. Brian McGee interviewed contemporary British philosophers in the 70s. And those interviews are still available. They're on YouTube. The one with Ayer is particularly instructive. We're going to see a segment of that down the road. Here's the program for revolutionary wool shearing and clear cutting. Language is meaningful if and only if it talks of what sense experience can verify. Else, it is nothing more than meaningless babble. So furthermore, this revolution in logic was intended to be a much more general revolution in human thought. Perhaps not quite so far-reaching as Descartes and the springhouse cleaning of the mind, but still pretty far. And logical positivism was a big deal. Language was the center of attention in logical positivism, but language was also paid attention to elsewhere as well. If we think about Wittgenstein up at Cambridge, if we think about Austin at Oxford. At Cambridge, the later Wittgenstein, and again, Wittgenstein is one of these funny philosophers who has an early and late period, and they're like two different people. But his later period, philosophy could be therapy for our linguistic neuroses, and that's for Wittgenstein about all it could ever do. But there are no real philosophy problems anymore. That was his way of taking language philosophy to see Popper object. Oxford Austin pointed out that words may not only describe, sometimes words can do. He was one of a number of Oxford language philosophers. In both these universities, language was in some other ways. Down in London, however, opposition was brewing, not only specifically to positivism at its verifiability principle of meaning, but in general to the received wisdom that philosophy was only or even mainly about language. You know, as Popper said, we saw that earlier, words don't matter. Words don't matter. The focus on language, Popper thinks, risks becoming a substitute for the real task of philosophy, which is to state and perhaps even solve intellectual problems. And Popper got into it with Wittgenstein. They both came from Vienna. That was part of what was behind their rivalry. And there's this famous incident in 1946 at the Moral Sciences Club. Popper was invited up from London to speak, and Wittgenstein allegedly threatened him with a fire poker. Popper had long been an opponent of the positivist movement, though, from its Viennese origin. About the time Ayer was publishing his masterpiece in Britain, 1936, Popper had already criticized positivism in his Logik der Forschung, Logic of Research, 1934, which didn't become translated into English until after the Second World War, 1959, as the Logic of Scientific Discovery. In print, major work worth reading. In that work, Popper's major criticism was it's not verifiability as positivism claimed, but falsifiability, which first of all gives us knowledge, and secondly makes scientific research distinctly a rational process. This is a big controversy in the philosophy of science. Logical positivism was big game. Popper was a big game hunter. Popper did target specifically logical positivism's verifiability principle, but he was after bigger game as well. Popper criticized severely Plato, along with Marx and Hegel, as anti-democratic to the point of totalitarian. The Open Society and Its Enemies, 2 volumes. He wrote this during World War II, 1945. Major political writing, which Popper remembered. Popper would also attack the very idea of inductive logic. We've already alluded to this. We'll come back to it presently. And this itself is no less audacious than Ayer's dismissal metaphysics and ethics. And Ayer says, of the 3 traditional branches of philosophy, do away with 2 of them. Popper says, of the 2 traditional branches of logic, do away with 1 of them. So different though they are, in that respect, they're comparable. Words don't matter, said Popper. It's a funny thing for a professor to say when he gets paid for words. But then Popper was exactly this kind of audacious. In 1949, he was appointed to London as professor of logic and scientific method, and had to give an introductory inaugural speech. And so he did. And he told his audience during the speech that the subject of scientific method does not exist. There's no such thing as scientific method. And he said, this is something I should know, since I happen to be the only professor of scientific method in the entire British Empire. Later, his student, Paul Feyerabend, would elaborate this in his famous book, Against Method. Heraclitus, way back, pre-Socratic, had said that word was the basis of physical reality. And Plato followed Heraclitus down this track. He too wanted to emphasize the importance of words in the Phaedo. he as Socrates say, "You can be sure, my dear Crito, that the misuse of words is not only troublesome in itself, but actually has a bad effect on the soul." Popper, who was Popper had a temper. He was known as the human blowtorch. In controversies, he would be very, very fierce. He flamed Plato in particular whenever he got an opportunity. This is partly what he's after here. You know, when he says words don't matter, it's this view that words and language are somehow metaphysically very, very important. Words don't matter. Could Popper really be serious? You know, is Wittgenstein just twiddling his thumbs? Is Austin just putting out gas? Well, if we do not interpret Popper literally, we might take him to be criticizing the whole tendency in philosophy from Plato to Ayer, Wittgenstein, Austin, to spend time merely playing with language at the expense of thinking about substantive problems of philosophy. And Popper says this in so many words. If you want to follow this up even more, there are a couple of interesting books on the subject. Popper's student and colleague Ernest Gellner, Words and Things, and then Ved Mehta, who just died this year, actually, Fly and Fly Bottle, about Oxford philosophy at that time. Will give you some good background. Truth be told, emphasis on the minutiae of language use could get really silly, really inbred and nitpicking. Jonathan Miller and Alan Bennett do a sketch here on Beyond the Fringe, which the interesting thing about this is the audience is laughing at this sketch because they recognize this is an educated audience of English people in mid 60s. They recognize exactly what's going on. They've seen this kind of stuff up at university all the time. But this is a caricature of how philosophers of that day carried on. Caricature, though, is not necessarily the converse of truth. Let's give it a listen.
Wittgenstein says, doesn't he, rather ham-handedly in my opinion, in the blue and brown books, of course, that the statement, "fetch me that slab," implies there is a slab, such that were I to fetch it, the statement, "fetch me that slab," would then be disjunctively denied by the opposite statement.
Yes?
Yes? Well, it seems to me Wittgenstein has made really rather a bad blunder here, for as far as I can see, the unfetched slab can claim to exist really no more than the unseen tree in the forest.
No. You're making rather a primitive category mistake here. Oh, no, you're not actually. It's me. I'm sorry.
All right. Yes. It seems to me, what in fact we have here really, is an example of a synthetic a priori proposition of the sort. Let me see now. Yes, there are no sense data. There are no sense data, which are both blue and green all over at the same time, and sense data.
And sense data, yes.
Which is a statement really both about our world as we know it, in Wittgenstein's sense, of course, of everything in this case, and a statement about our language as we use it. Now, I know that you get very worked up about propositional, disjunctive functions, Billy, so I thought you might have to deal with the whole sort of thing and put it on some sort of...
Yes.
I see. Well, tell me, are you in fact using yes in its affirmative sense here?
No. I like that paper. You see, I liked it because it rather bears on something I'm considering myself. Namely, what part, you see, what role we as philosophers play in this great heterogeneous, confusing and confused jumble of political, social and economic relationships we call society. I mean, other people, they have jobs to do, don't they? What do people do these days?
They row lawns, I believe.
As they do, or they drive buses, or they sell ice cream, or they play games.
Oh.
Games.
More important.
Much more important. Yes, now we also play games, you see, but we as philosophers, we play language games, don't we? We play games, language games. When you and I go onto the cricket pitch, we do so secure in the knowledge that a game of cricket is, it's in the offing, isn't it? It's not in progress, it's in the offing. But when we play language games, we do so rather in order to find out what game it is we're playing. In other words, why do we do philosophy at all?
Yes, why?
Why?
Yes, why? Yes, indeed. Yes, why? Yes, why? Yes. No, no, you see, I think I must take exception with you on that point, Beanie, because, you see, I think we want to ask not so much why questions, you see, as how questions.
Why?
There you are. Need I say more?
Yes, you need a great deal.
I tell you, it seems to be that philosophers, or at least they like to call themselves philosophers, you see, who start by asking why questions, they end up by making pseudo-statements, you see. Pseudo-statements of the sort, well, let me see now. Saturday got into bed with me as one.
Is that a pseudo-statement?
All right, well, I'll take another example from real life, if you like, and really hammer home the point. There's too much Tuesday in my beetroot salad. What about that?
Oh, well, that is, of course, that's a classic example, but I don't think you're saying, and I don't say you're thinking, but I don't think you're saying that such statements are in themselves meaningless, are they?
All I'm saying really, you see, such statements are in effect metaphysical statements.
Metaphysical statements. Well, of course, if they're metaphysical statements, I don't think we should forget, or I don't think you should forget, as Bradley pointed out, the man who rejects the existence of metaphysics is simply a metaphysician with a rival theory of his own. Yeah.
Yes. So this was the sort of thing that Popper objected to. It's a colossal waste of time. They're really quite good at this. They have a lot of the catchwords, sense, no, that's Freddie Ayer and pseudo assertions and language games from Wittgenstein. So this was a caricature, but not necessarily untruth. Okay, got a news flash for you. Language is not the enemy, says the news desk. Well, whoever said it was. Actually, some philosophers did. Symbolic logic gets formulated in order to sidestep some of the inevitable ambiguity in natural languages. The extreme way to do this is to insist on the purification from ambiguity of all language. So, in a sense, ordinary language, yes, is the enemy. Logical positivism went on to say that the only permissible uses of language were science, logic, maths, and perhaps common sense. That meant a lot of the rest of language was misleading, perhaps even dangerous. This called for a purge of all those meaningless pseudo-statements. Well, on this point of view, a lot of language is meaningless pseudo-statements. Yes, language kind of is the enemy. And then, too, Popper's attack on the language philosophy of his day might be taken in several ways. Words don't matter, really, in every or all senses, or should we just ignore language? Although Popper, of course, when pressed on this point, denies that. But as a result of these developments, every logic textbook has a language chapter, usually chapter 2, bending over backwards to explain that language is not the enemy. And I think this must be kind of puzzling to the average student if they don't have this background in the history of philosophy, which is why in my course I spend some time on that. Mr. Hurley's chapter has absolutely nothing about this, and typically the language chapters don't explain its background. But I think it's absolutely crucial to understand that background in order to understand the importance of language and why we even worry about it in the first place. I think if you don't have that background, though, you might think, why are they protesting about all this? Why are they protesting over much? I think the answer to this puzzle lies in the fact that the generation of philosophers who wrote logic textbooks and are still writing them grew up when logical positivism still had way. And positivism held a very constricted, what might say extreme and intolerant view of language. So they're like the proverbial generals fighting the wars from when they were lieutenants. Whoever said the pen is mightier than the sword obviously never encountered automatic weapons. The residual effect of logical positivism remains a sort of elephant in the room that not everyone wants to talk about. Subsequently, philosophers have become more sensible and tolerant of the range of things language can do, apart from the very precise things they want in logic. But it may be worth exploring at some length how this came about. So, what did logical positivism say? Well, logical positivism combines two main theses: verifiability theory of meanings, we've seen, and a strict empiricism asserting that visual observation which verifies is a pretty straightforward bringing in of Freddie as sense data. Well, even a cursory consideration of visual illusions will suggest why strict empiricism, number two, the straightforward interpretation of visual observation, is highly flawed. It's very easy to trick the eye. It's very easy to trick the sense. And these are just the simple ones. We're not even getting into the gorilla in the room and the famous rubber arm experiment and all that kind of stuff. Just look at the bottom. You've got ruler liar illusion, the arrowheads and the lines laid out on a ruler. And I've looked at this however many times. It's 5 inches minus 4 inches is minus 1 inch is 4 inches. Sorry, 9 inches minus 5 inches is 4 inches. But the 4 inches to the left still looks bigger than the 4 inches to the right, even though I I can see that there are 4 inches in each case, but it doesn't look that way to my eye. There are all kinds of things that show this, but even in science, but also in common sense, vision and observation are always metaphorical, not straightforwardly literal. And once again, I refer you to the lecture on rationalism and empiricism from philosophers in the early and middle 20th century, those involved in the growth and development of positivism, were not unaware of this problem. So Grant's in 1912, that appearance is not reality. In 1940, he says that strict empiricism, naive realism, is ultimately self-refuting. But it's kind of like the problem of induction. Hume's problem of induction. They recognize it, but they don't quite know what to make of it. They don't follow out the full implications. Yet much of the rhetoric concerning science, including among philosophers such as positivists, carried on as if these things were not so, that one could talk blithely about induction and data. Throughout the 20th century, critics would press home this basic insight about empiricism against logical positivism in various ways. Data is theory-laden. Facts are facts only in relation to some theory on which they bear. Any and every theory might be verified by some empirical observation or other, even false theory. There's the underdetermination by data, the famous Toulmin. Empirical generalizations are never inductively derived. No number of confirming observations, no matter how many, can ever prove an empirical generalization. Snapshot of all this criticism in the 20th century of straightforward empiricism has been to go back to Kant. Kant said sometime before in the 18th century, percepts without concepts are blind, concepts without percept are empty. In a sense, Kant is a 20th century philosopher. He's come into his own really in the 20th century in debates about empiricism and the philosophy of science. Important note, criticize the positivist take on what empiricism is not the same as to abandon empiricism outright. Kant himself did not do this. I think you could read Kant as offering a better version of empiricism, what we might call empiricism 2.0, against the inadequacy of the earlier statements. Kant put forward what's sometimes called a logical empirical view. That's a good characterization. To the extent that Kant's view may have displaced those of Locke and Hume, it's sometimes it appears something like what I call empiricism 2.0. And again, if you want to follow that up, I developed that notion in the introductory lecture. But what about thesis 1, the verifiability principle? Harold Brown says this about that. The central doctrine of logical positivism is the verification theory of meaning, thesis that a contingent proposition is meaningful if and only if there is an empirical method for deciding if it's true or false. If no such method exists, it is a meaningless pseudo proposition. What does he have in mind here? Okay, let's take these two propositions, for example. All matter is composed of atoms, or Paris is a city in France. These are two examples that positivists, I think, would probably agree are examples of meaningful propositions. Because there are observations that can verify them. Of course, atoms aren't visible to the naked eye, but using a cloud chamber, one can see traces made by subatomic particles. Oh, there are. Okay, it's just a message. So there is some sense data that can be brought to bear on this statement. Matter can be seen to be composed of atoms. Of course, what is it that tells me I'm looking at is evidence of atoms rather than just a bunch of lines in a cloud chamber? Only a prior theory, which includes the Rutherford atom model, which enables me to see in a certain way, which makes the cloud chamber sense data necessarily theory laden from the outset. This is part of the main criticism of the positivist use of empiricism. Or I could go to Paris and see, yes, there is a city called Paris, and it is in France. Your eyes can tell you that. So these kinds of things, within some limits, are examples of what can be verified by empirical sense data, by observation. Okay, what about the other column, the meaningless column? Well, here are a couple of examples I think that positivists would probably again exemplify the meaningless kind. Suppose I say God is just and good, or suppose I say, opposed to Paris being a city in France, I say Paris is the most beautiful city in France. Well, now, atoms are visible, at least indirectly. One can visit Paris and see it. Therefore, there are empirical means for deciding whether these propositions are true. But on the other hand, terms like God, ought, justice, goodness, right, wrong, beauty, none of these things are observable. I got a question for you. Why is a mouse when it spins? Why is a mouse when it spins? Why is a mouse when it spins? Colorless green ideas sleep furiously. Now, problem's not with you, problem's with me. Those are nonsense statements. Those are meaningless. And meaningless is so much worse than false. The Greeks referred to foreigners as barbarians. That's where we get our word barbarian, because the notion was, if you don't speak the pure and good Greek language, when you open your mouth, all that comes out is bar, 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 just meaningless gibberish. So hoi barbaroi are the people who speak the bar, 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 that is to say, the non-Greeks. To say something meaningless, utter something meaningless is so much worse than to utter something that is false. So, if God is unobservable, should one embrace atheism instead? Somebody asked Freddie Ayer this question. He said, no, the non-existence of God is every bit as meaningless a question as the existence of God. Any proposition that uses a concept like God is not talking about observables. If I put up a poster that says God exists, I might as well put up a billboard. I might as well put up one that just says bar, 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 bar. And likewise, if I put up one that says God does not exist. This axiom led the logical positivists to dismiss whole swaths of traditional discourse, both inside philosophy and outside. On this view, science can tell us about the world, but philosophy cannot. Philosophy can tell us about language, but so much of what passes for language involves just meaningless pseudo-propositions. In particular, metaphysics is meaningless. Theology, insofar as it relies on metaphysics, also a non-starter. Since ought is also an unobservable, ought being the key term in ethical statements, then ethics is meaningless too. Poetry, well, poetry is not reducible to observation statements, so it too is simply gibberish. That really throws out a lot of stuff. Before logical positivism came along, there was a ready-made way to handle ethics in a similar fashion. It's something not basically cognitive at all. G.E. Moore in Principia Ethica had developed the view that ethical properties like good or bad couldn't be translated into non-ethical ones without incurring the naturalistic fallacy. Earlier still, David Hume had laid the groundwork for thinking the case. Moore pointed out that ethical statements commonly attempt to do exactly what Hume said they can't do. He's right that they can't, this can't be done. And so ethical statements commonly wind up committing the natural fallacy. So what is the status then of ethical statements? Well, they're not statements of fact. They can't be reduced to statements of fact. And then the question arises for Moore and others, are they even cognitive in the first place? Moore wished to maintain they were cognitive, but the line of questioning that Hume and then Moore initiated led others, including Ayer, to conclude they were not. This led to what's known as the emotivist theory of ethics, which Ayer embraced. Motivism says that ought statements never express propositions or even cognitive content. They merely express psychological attitudes. This is sometimes called the Boole-Yeh theory. of ethics. So if I say cannibalism is wrong or murder is bad, don't murder, I'm not really uttering a meaningful proposition like if I said today is Wednesday. I'm simply emoting. I'm saying boo on murder. I find murder is icky and I wish you wouldn't do it. I wish you would find it icky too. Yay, boo. That's no real cognitive content, no real intellectual discussion going on there. Thus, logical positivist program for reforming language became out with ethics. It's at best, a pseudo proposition like eating people is wrong. It'd be given the emotive meaning. I feel cannibalism is icky. We should do boo on cannibalism. Theology is not knowledge. It is, at best, as Ayer put it, simply tortured academic poetry. Not just poetry, which is meaningless, but academic poetry. And on the subject of poetry itself, well, it's just so much bar, 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 bar. So a lot of stuff is gone. This is most sweeping. Down with metaphysics, ethics, theology, poetry, indeed with any use of language, which is not strictly logical. Okay. What happened? Well, what happened is logical positivism went down. Eventually, it succumbed to a fatal flaw. Its very appeal was its boldness and rigidity. The verifiability principle of meaning is a very strong thesis about empiricism. If you can't observe it, you can't talk about it. Or if you try, you only appear to be talking bar, 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 why is a mouse with its pins? But if you push this exemplary rigidity to its limits, you eventually discover a fatal inconsistency. Remember what the verifiability principle says. A contingent proposition is meaningful if and only if there's an empirical method for deciding if it's true or false. If such method exists, then it is a meaningless pseudo proposition. As it turns out, the verifiability principle is not itself verifiable by the empirical method it specifies as the basic of meaningfulness. Think about that. Verifiability principle itself is not verifiable by its own method. So here's a smart alecky philosophy student. The only true statements are those that are empirically verifiable. The statement that only true statements are those that are empirically verifiable is not empirically verifiable and therefore not true. But my dogmatic commitment to logical positivism, a number of bottles get emptied with a revolver on the table. Therefore, if the verifiability principle of logical positivism is true, then logical positivism is deeply flawed. That is, it is meaningless on its own terms. But if the verifiability is false, then logical positivism is pointless. This is an epic fail. This is really, really bad. It's a smackdown. Now, I mentioned Brian McGee's series of interviews, and they're very good to watch. Unfortunately, the production values, 1978 BBC, not terribly good by our standards, but ignore that. The content is really interesting. Here's Brian McGee interviewing Ayer in 1978, and he asked him about logical positivism. Ayer explained it, and then he said, but were there any problems with it? And Ayer said, and this is his life's work, the thing for which Freddie Ayer is the most well known. He said, nearly all of it was false. Let's give that interview a listen. It's worth listening to a bit of it.
But now, it must have had actually some real defects. What do you now, in retrospect, think that the main shortcomings of the movement were?
Well, I suppose most of the defects is that nearly all of it was false.
Well, I think you need to say a little more about that.
Well, that's being too harsh on it, because I think that I still want to say that it was true in spirit, in a way, that the attitude was right. But if one goes for the details, first of all, the verification principle never got itself properly formulated. I tried several times, and it always let in either too little or too much. And to this day, it hasn't received a properly, logically precise formulation. Then the reductionism just doesn't work. I mean, you can't reduce statements. You can't reduce even ordinary, simple statements about cigarette cases and glasses and ashtrays to statements about sense data. Let alone the more abstract statements of science. So the really exciting strict reductionism of Schlick and the early Russell and so on doesn't work. And the only one is rather wishy-washy, which almost nobody would dissent from, that a scientific hypothesis must have some relation to observation. I mean, this is all that remains there. It seems to me at least very doubtful whether statements of logic and mathematics are analytic in any interesting sense. But the whole analytic synthetic distinction has been put in question by the work of recent philosophers like Quine. It's no longer, I think so. I still want to maintain it in some form. It's no longer so clear-cut as I once thought it was. And I'm not sure. In some sense, obviously, statements of mathematics are different from statements about the empirical world. But saying, as I said, they're true by convention, I'm not at all sure this is right. Anyhow, it needs a lot of defending. Again, the whole, I mean, certainly in language and logic, the reduction of statements about the past to statements about their future evidence for them is wrong. My treatment of other minds was wrong. My treatment of ethics, I think, was still on the right lines, though much too summary. So if you go in detail, very, very little survives. What survives is the sort of general rightness of the approach, I think.
Would you agree with me if I try to put it this way, that looking back on it, what seems to have been enormously good about the achievement of logical positivism is almost entirely negative? That is to say, it did clear away whole areas of hitherto plausible philosophizing, which were now seen under through the lenses of the new logic and the new science, not to be acceptable. So that whole traditional areas got, so to speak, cleared of lumber. But it now looks as if all they actually succeeded in doing was clear the ground, because what they tried to build on that ground that they cleared isn't standing up.
Well, it's a little more than this. It was very liberating. I think perhaps we can go back to something said not by a logical positivist, but by a pragmatist, William James. And of course, pragmatism, which came earlier, is in many ways very akin to logical positivism. William James had a phrase in which he asked for the cash value of statements. Now, I think this is very important on the positive side. The early positivists went wrong in thinking that we still maintained a gold standard. That if you presented your notes, you could get gold for them, which, of course, you can't. There isn't enough gold, and too many notes. But nevertheless, there must be some backing to the currency. And this is, I think, what comes out. But if someone makes an assertion, all right, perhaps you can't translate it into observational terms, but still, it's important to ask, for clarifying it, how you would set about testing it, what observations were. But this, I think, still holds good and is positive.
Former logical positivists like yourself, although you now say that most of the detailed doctrines are false, are still immensely influenced by that whole approach, and are addressing yourself to much the same questions, but in a more liberal, open sort of way.
I would say this is so, yes. Now, I'm a much older man. I do it much more slowly, possibly, almost certainly with less brilliance. There wasn't any brilliance before. Perhaps more soundly. I hope perhaps I've learned something with the years.
Thank you very much, Professor Ayer.
Yes, I find that quite extraordinary, but also quite instructive about philosophy, what it tries to do. George Orwell made this comment, which I think is apropos of what we've just seen. Autobiography is only to be trusted when it reveals something. A man who gives a good account of himself is probably lying, since any life, when viewed from the inside, is simply a series of defeats. This sort of radical, shattering honesty is not going to happen often, but if it does, it's likely to happen in philosophy. Another example, Bertie Russell wrote to his mistress, Lady Ottoline Morell, about the effect of Wittgenstein's criticism. Russell was the big guy from about, let's say, the 1900, 1905, and then afterwards. I mean, the big guy in British philosophy. When I encountered Wittgenstein's criticism, it was an event, he said, of first rate importance to my life and affected everything I've done since. I saw he was right, and I saw that I could not hope ever again to do fundamental work in philosophy. This is quite a major statement. Earlier, Frege had said much the same thing in response to criticism by Russell of himself, that it destroyed his life's work. Hardly anything more unfortunate can befall a scientific writer, said Frege, than to have one of the foundations of his edifice shaken after the work is finished. This was the position I was placed in by a letter of Mr. Bertrand Russell, just when the printing of this volume, Grundgesetze, was nearing its completion. And as a result, Frege abandoned his work and didn't finish it. It's difficult to overstate just how truly extraordinary an admission like this on the part of Ayer, on the part of Russell, on the part of Frege is, just imagine a bishop saying, oh, sorry, folks, the church just got that redemption business all wrong, or an astrologer saying, whoops, turns out that clairvoyance is not possible and astrology is just simply false. It doesn't happen. But I think it's emblematic of what philosophers do, that, well, you won't always be correct. You may find that you've gone up a blind alley, but even if that's all you find out, you have learned something. Sometimes you win, sometimes you learn. So I find this interview with Ayer quite extraordinary, but also in a sense emblematic. But what Ayer said to McGee in this interview in 1978 had been common knowledge for some time already. John Passmore, who wrote the article on logical positivism in the Encyclopedia of Philosophy, and also wrote a very history of philosophy. Put it this way, in 1967, logical positivism then is dead, or as dead as a philosophical movement ever becomes. Postmortem, perhaps the most important thing to note is not simply the fact that it's largely false and therefore dead, but that it was a very bold and revolutionary conjecture about empiricism, about the importance of language, and about the task of philosophy. It was debated and found to be a dead end, and therefore, by rejecting a dead end, philosophy may have been said to have exhibited some progress. That becomes interesting in light of the common contrast between the sciences, which progress rapidly, and philosophy, which generally does not progress much. Here is a counterexample, if you will. But having said that, logical positivism is a little bit undead too. It's hard to tell how much is cause and how much is effect. However, even if positivism is dead to philosophy, there remains a residual positivism in the general culture, what you might call dragnet empiricism in folk culture. Maybe one echo effect of this. So this is really reaching back, but there was an old show, the cop show Dragnet in the 1950s, Detective Sergeant Joe Friday would cut to the chase by saying, "Just the facts, man. Just the facts. Bit of facts. Tell me what you saw. Tell me straightforwardly." And that's kind of a logical positivist on things. Also, in a weird way, there's kind of a creationist argument against evolution that runs. If no one was around to observe the origin of life, therefore, evolution is faith, not science. And that's a kind of positivist on science too, although from a religious point of view, which is not the point of view that positivism adopts, certainly. The supposition that science has abolished God talk is another echo of the effect of logical positivism. God talk was in cognitive trouble long before Ayer tried to do it in. The fact that Ayer failed does not imply that the other difficulties have finished. The residual standing of positivism's emotivist theory of ethics must be reckoned one factor in what is a fashionable moral relativism among the educated, whereby, for instance, self-styled progressives refuse to call out quite barbarous human rights abuse. And Sam Harris, in his book on the moral landscape, has an interesting example of that. Most Western intellectuals would say, well, there's nothing for the Dalai Lama to be really right about, or for Ted Bundy, who's a serial killer, to be really wrong about in the midst of a real argument that potentially falls within the purview of science. He likes chocolate, he likes vanilla. There's just nothing one to be able to say to the other that should persuade the other. That is, the notion that talking about ought statements and talking about ethics is just a matter of emotivism, emotion, yay and boo, Harris thinks has had a deleterious effect on our ability to talk sense. Isaiah Berlin put this point in earlier times. Well, what's the difference between me and Himmler? I prefer kindness, and the other guy prefers concentration camps. Okay, we have different tastes, different strokes for different folks. No, that's a problem. To illustrate just how far this has gone among the educated and the progressive, Harris tells this story. I find it an appalling story of a conversation he had with an advisor to the Obama administration on bioethics medicine. This is highly educated. Harris says to her, "What if we found a culture that ritually blinded every third child by literally plucking out his or her eyes at birth? Would you then agree that we had found a culture that was needlessly diminishing human well-being?" And she responded, "Well, it would depend on why they were doing it." Wow. He responds to that. Let's say they were doing it on the basis of religious superstition. In their scripture, God says every third must walk in darkness. And her response is, then you could never say that they were wrong. That is the standard for moral discussion in a lot of places among a lot of smart people today. I don't believe that women have any rights, and I think gays should be hanged. Well, what a complete primitive asshole you are. You must be a Republican if somebody comes at it from a right-wing point of view. But if someone says, oh, no, these are my religious beliefs, well, oh, okay. I'm sorry, I apologize. I don't want you to think I was homophobic. Then you could never say that they were wrong. There's a case to be made that after positivism and its emotivist account of ethics, the moral landscape has altered and has altered fundamentally. This is Harris's point. It's one worth considering. Likewise, the mistrust of depth psychology on the grounds that the inner life is unobservable. In psychology, behaviorism persists even though its basis is basically logical positivism, was debunked a long time ago. So, despite the formal demise of logical positivism in academic philosophy, there remain certain residual assumptions there, particularly in logic courses. First of all, the assumption that ambiguity in natural language can be and needs to be abolished. Secondly, the assumption that cognitive clarity can be achieved by purging language of all its emotive meaning. I want us to take these up in part 2, and spoiler alert, surprise, surprise. I want to argue that take on ambiguity and that take on purging language of emotional meaning needs some serious thought. Well, thank you for listening today. This has been Michael Cavanaugh. Good day.